I wanted to share in this mini lesson a few tips for writing chapter 3, and you can apply them as you're writing your outline or keep them in the back of your mind as you write or start revising your methods chapter. The thing about chapter 3 is that it isn't hard to write superficially, but you don't know what you don't know at this point, and you're not supposed to know what you don't know that you don't know at this point. That's okay. That's why we have people to help us. First tip. Chapter 3 is really like a recipe. It starts with some background information and it ends with very detailed instruction. And here's why. Structurally, social science writing, research writing started out by mimicking the traditions of the physical and biological sciences. That type of research came first. I'm guessing this is because the format was both familiar, but also helped add credibility to research topics and methods that were just emerging. Answering those questions, is this valid? Is this reliable? Most methods chapters, whether they are experimental or not, are set up to read like an experiment, even if you in your research are not performing any interventions. But I'd like to remind us that in the social science, we have a much harder time controlling variables. I'm sure you've all realized that. We are not studying light waves. We are not that follow Newtonian physics. We're not studying chemical reactions or amoeba in a petri dish in a lab. We are studying people. And very few social sciences can be performed in a lab, although the psychologists may beg to differ. Even in studies that do include a comparison group, and I'm using the word comparison group because we don't use control group unless it's an empirical study, that includes an intervention. In education, we still tend to perform those interventions in the field. Qualitative methods are newer and they were created, tested, and validated. And so these are the methods many of you are going to be talking about in your methods chapter. However, traditions are hard to break. And a key element of lab research is that the experiment is replicable, which is why chapter 3 reads like a recipe. Now, most qualitative studies aren't replicable by their nature in an experimental sense, but over time and using validated methods as you are, and over many, many studies, they begin to develop a generalizable theory. But I digress. That is why chapter 3 reads like a recipe. Let's take a look at tip 2, and I promise none of these are nearly as long as that little soliloquy. Methods chapters tend to follow the same format. So we talked about what goes into a recipe. There is a format for that recipe, which without going into too much detail or rehashing tip 1, this is the format that your readers expect. Recall in module 4, week 1 mini lesson, that one of the purposes of chapter 3 is to prove that you know what you're doing research wise. In a dissertation, the methods chapter is more extensive than a journal article, but across the journal article and the dissertation, they are structured the same way because of those expectations and because it helps prove you know what you're doing. Edgewood's template is great. It follows that expectation. So for chapter 3, I wouldn't recommend varying too much from it unless recommended by your advisor. All right, tip 3, more is more. This is probably the most annoying and the hardest part of chapter 3. You need to be very explicit about what you plan to do and how you plan to do it, right down to how you are keeping data safe. It's all those annoying questions that are on the IRB application covers. For the proposal, you might not be aware of all these intricate steps, and that's totally okay. Do what you can and let your research specialists and advisors point out what you're missing. If you're not quite sure how to fix that, you'll have time as you prepare your defense. If you're doing a statistical analysis, for example, you might think you're going about all the tests in the appropriate way, but there may be other tests that you don't even realize exist that you have to perform to get the data where you need it for the actual method that you'll be using, or to explain why your results that you got exist. There's probably some statistics that you then perform as well. If you're quoting qualitative data, you may not realize what happens in each data pass in the specifics way. And that's why we have experts that can help us. I will say I'm not a research expert. I am an instructional methodologist, but we have great research experts in Kirsten, or Dr. Brown and Dr. Lee, And and hopefully you have chosen an advisor and are working with an advisor that has some familiarity with your method as well. So they can point some of those deficits out as you start to develop chapter 3 more over the course of writing your dissertation. The point is, you gotta write everything down step by step. Those are the directions section of a recipe. All right, tip 4. Stylistically, if your writing sounds like a robot wrote it, then you're probably good. That means you need to have short declarative sentences. You need to avoid modifiers and try to avoid multi-clausal sentences, which are really fun to write, but don't belong in the style of a chapter 3. And by all means, do not sneak anything in that sounds like an opinion. Remember, everything that you write will need to be justified, which we'll talk about in tip 5. So tip 5, as I alluded to, is all choices that you make regarding your methods and that you write about needs to be justified. And we do that either with logic by explaining how this is going to help answer the research question, or by context, that we had some limiting factors and that's how we chose our sample, or that's how we recruited participants. As you prepare for your proposal, if your methods section is reasonable, it justifies all your decisions that you have made at this point, is grounded in a well-developed methodological approach, and uses reliable protocols. And if they're not validated, that's okay, but you do need to talk about how you go through the process of making sure they're valid and reliable. And there's ways to do that statistically. You're going to be okay. I'm going to leave it there. That's it for this week. I am looking forward to see how those outlines come together, and really looking forward to reading your chapter 3s.